I'm Bonnie Lin, Director of the ChinaPower Project and Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this episode of the ChinaPower Podcast, we will be discussing the recent 2025 Shangri-La Dialogue, Asia's premier defense summit. What were the key themes this year and who were the notable attendees? How did U.S.-China relations play a role in the recent dialogue? And what policy recommendations for managing current geopolitical tensions did the dialogue produce? To explore these questions and more, we're joined by Ms. Meia Nouwens and Ms. Veerle Nouwens. Ms. Meia Nouwens is a Senior Fellow for Chinese Security and Defense Policy. Meia's expertise lies in China's cross-service defense analysis, Chinese defense industry and innovation, as well as China's regional strategic affairs and international relations. She leads IISS research on China's digital Silk Road and was co-lead of the China Security Project with Merix. Prior to IISS, she worked for the European External Action Service as a policy officer in Taipei and as a trade analyst in the EU's delegation to New Zealand. She has previously worked in private sector consulting firms and international organizations on topics of foreign policy, security, and defense. Meia holds a BA Honors in International Relations and Political Science, a Master's in International Relations and Diplomacy, and an MPhil in Modern Chinese Studies. Ms. Veerle Nouwens is the Executive Director for IISS Asia. Veerle's expertise lies in Chinese foreign and defense policy, as well as the wider Indo-Pacific defense and security environment. She plays a key part in organizing the annual IISS Shangri-La Dialogue, provides intellectual direction for IISS research on the Asia-Pacific, and works to enhance the profile of IISS across the region and beyond. Prior to joining IISS, Veerle worked as Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London, where she established the Indo-Pacific program and focused on China and Indo-Pacific security, and as a policy officer in the political section of the European Union delegation in Singapore. She has previously worked in a range of think tank and international organizations on topics of foreign policy, security, and defense. Veerle holds a BA Honors in International Relations and Political Science, a Master's in International Relations and Diplomacy, and an MPhil in Modern Chinese Studies. Meia, Veerle, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Veerle, let me start with you. The Shangri-La Dialogue is broadly understood to be Asia's premier defense summit, and this year being the 22nd year it was held. From your perspective, what were the goals for organizing this dialogue, and what did you see as the key overarching themes that came through this year?
Thanks, Bonnie. So the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue doesn't assign an overarching theme each year. Rather, its primary purpose is really to offer a platform for defense diplomacy for governments from the Asia-Pacific, but also outside of the region. And it really does so through public and on-the-record statements by defense ministers, chiefs of defense, and heads of government, followed, of course, by engagement with the audience through an open and on-the-record Q&A. But it also offers that space for hundreds of private bilaterals, multilaterals, and other private discussions. However, if you look at the agenda, there were some key session themes that I think were particularly relevant to the current regional climate and to cross-regional security interlinkages. One of those is, of course, how to manage proliferation, and that includes nuclear. So think of, the DPRK, and nuclear dynamics in Asia, but also Iran was mentioned a few times. And then, of course, on top of that, there's more general questions of conventional proliferation in the region and beyond as well, and how those dynamics relate to one another. The other interesting themes that I thought were very timely were the opportunities and challenges for defense in the domains of cyber, outer space, and undersea. And of course, many refer to issues such as cable cutting, to the importance of satellite technology in defense. And of course, cyber is a mainstay of defense and security discussions these days. But also two others that I did want to highlight are one, crisis management. And of course, the India-Pakistan conflict that had happened not too long before the dialogue is an example of that. But so too are, still some of the tensions in the Asia-Pacific region around issues like the South China Sea. And then finally, opportunities and challenges for defense innovation. So really governments coming together and thinking around how defense can mitigate challenges, but also how they can use new technologies to leverage new strengths in the defense domain.
Veerle, it seems like the sessions really highlighted a range of challenges, everything from challenges coming from particular regional actors to challenges in the functional space, as well as course of activities engaged by different actors. Were there any particular challenge that you saw that most speakers and participants identify as most pressing or most challenging?
Yeah, so I think there were some threads that ran through quite a lot of the interventions. Bonnie, you saw the mention of hybrid threats as one of those. A lot of countries kind of struggling and grappling with this challenge and how to respond to them effectively, but one would also imagine proportionately. The other, of course, was cross-regional security. The fact that what's happening in the Middle East, in Europe, and in Asia all is interconnected, and that can't be underestimated, and that certainly isn't becoming less complex. And then I think finally, there were mentions again of the international order. And I think that really underscored a sense of uncertainty in that respect and potential instability. So quite a few interventions noted that you do need a strong regional security architecture. You do need partnerships to really shore up what is being seen as an uncertain moment in time.
I do want to follow up on your mentioning of the international order, perhaps a little bit later. I think you're referring to some of the changes that we're seeing, particularly on the U.S. end. But before we get to that, I want to turn to Meia to ask a bit about what she observed as Chinese activities at the Shangri-La Dialogue. We know that Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun was notably absent. How would you characterize the Chinese attendance this year? Were they as active as prior years? And were there any particular messages that you saw Chinese participants deliver at the dialogue that stood out to you, or in some ways was different or perhaps the same as prior years?
You're right to note that the Chinese attendance this year as Shangri-La Dialogue was a lower level than in the previous few years. In the previous few years, the defense minister has headed the delegation. This year, a delegation did attend, but it was headed by Rear Admiral Hu Gongfeng, who is the vice president of the National Defense University of the PLA. Of course, there was a delegation attached to him that traveled with him. I would say that although there was a lower level representation by the Chinese this year, they were, of course, active. Rear Admiral who participated in one of the simultaneous special sessions on which he spoke in a panel on the topic of cooperative maritime security in the Asia-Pacific. And in addition, as in every year and with most delegations and participants at the Shangri-La Dialogue, there was active participation from the floor by others from the PRC delegation in terms of asking questions or making statements and generally engaging. In terms of the tone of the participation from this year's Chinese delegation, I think, as always, and with other delegations, there is a two-part aim. Firstly, to present a country's own perspectives on the state of regional security, what the key challenges are, how they seek to address those, and perhaps make some pointed policy statements. On the other hand, there is a lot of engagement, trying to understand better others' perspectives and policy statements as well. And in this year's participation from the PRC, that was, again, a common thread that we've seen. I don't think there was much change in the tone. I think, generally speaking, the messages were on point of what we've heard before in previous years. Questions from the floor can be sharp, can be quite pointed, but again, China isn't alone in that.
And Meia, as you were observing Chinese activities or messages, did you get a sense that they were less critical of the United States or about the same? Because one of the interpretations for why Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun did not go to the Shangri-La Dialogue was because last year when he went, he was quite pointed on stage and had made a lot of remarks that were viewed as quite pointed against the United States. So some of the U.S. posited that maybe he avoided going to avoid that very public display against the U.S. Did you see any of that at all?
I think in terms of criticism of the U.S., I actually thought that there were direct questions to Secretary Hegseth in his Q&A from one of the Chinese participants. I don't think it was necessarily a platform to criticize the United States. Thinking about the on-the-record remarks from Rear Admiral Hu during his participation in one of the simultaneous special sessions, he broadly talked about the challenges that the maritime domain faces So it wasn't necessarily used as a speech to directly criticize the United States. Instead, it was used as an opportunity to talk about China's offer, about multilateralism, about dialogue and consultation and cooperation, about international frameworks guiding that cooperation, international law guiding that cooperation. So in that sense, that speech, I think, was one that was focused more on addressing the relationships that China has in the region with what it sees as regional partners. There was, of course, a pointed statement in his on the record remarks, and I think those were directed at Taiwan in particular. And as he noted, the Taiwan independent separatist forces, which he then kind of broadly talked around certain countries. And we know that that's a veiled way of discussing the United States and its support of these Taiwan independent separatist forces, as he framed in particular the DPP, as well as calling out the US's so-called freedom of navigation and making some other statement. So it wasn't very direct, it was indirect, but I would say it was also a minor point in that on the record remarks, rather than the focus of the entire speech.
And Veerle, did you want to jump in too?
Thank you, Bonnie. So I know that there's obviously been a lot of speculation as to why the Chinese defense minister didn't participate at this year's dialogue. That will no doubt continue to be the case. But at the end of the day, I don't think anybody definitively knows that. All I can say in that respect is that we certainly hope that the defense minister will participate next year. But in terms of why the defense minister wasn't there this year, I think I would direct your question to China.
Thank you. I want to switch to talking about some of the key speeches as well as keynotes. Veerle, we saw that French President Emmanuel Macron was there and he delivered a keynote remark this year. Could you share with us why he was chosen as the keynote and what you saw as the key takeaways from his remarks?
So, I think this was a particularly interesting moment. It's noteworthy that President Macron is the first European to have ever been invited to deliver a keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue in its 22 years. And I think the reason is that, of course, as I've mentioned, cross-regional security is a major theme in the dialogue as the world becomes even more complex in the security and defense space. And we've seen so many of those linkages really be brought to the fore over the last couple of years. And so this was an excellent time, I think, for Europe, and particularly a European country that is the most present in the Asia-Pacific, to offer its vision and view on what regional security looks like, what its national priorities are in that respect, but also France as a P5 country, as a nuclear state, to offer that global vision as well. And so I think President Macron did that. He offered an interesting new positive alliance for Europe and Asia. He really underscored shared norms of open trade, open dialogue, but also new coalitions to stabilize the open and rules-based order. And in that respect, he pointed towards the fact that this idea of strategic autonomy is one that France, of course, strongly believes in, Europeans strongly believe in, but that he said, this is something that other countries in the region want as well. So that space and that agency to make decisions for themselves and to create those new partnerships, not because they have to, but because they want to. He posited Europe in that respect really as a third way amid great power competition between the United States and China. He noted that France would relaunch its Indo-Pacific strategy in the near future as well. So that's something for us all to look forward to. I think overall, the feedback was very positive. I think in the Asia-Pacific regions, countries are looking to diversify their partnerships, not least in defense and security as well. And Europe has an interesting offer in that respect. But I think there could have perhaps also been a little bit more kind of concrete ideas. Having said that, at the same time, this is a keynote speech. So by nature, it is going to be more about vision and bigger picture analysis of global and regional trends.
Could you share a little bit more about what he actually means by new coalitions stabilize the rule-based international order? Both in his speech as well as in the other speeches, what did participants identify as the challenges that the international order is facing right now?
I think in this respect, there is a concern, I suppose, and this was underscored by Dato' Seri Anwar Ibrahim, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, in his special address on the Saturday. And I encourage everyone to listen to that intervention as well, because I think he really underscored what countries, especially small and middle-sized countries, feel, which is this pressure that we're heading into kind of bloc-to-bloc politics, and that therefore countries are forced to choose one side or another. That's not a new statement or concern, but that seemed to be a theme again this year. So what there was a call for, not just by President Macron, but also others, was to kind of reinvest in that existing multilateral security architecture, be that at the regional or kind of global level. But then at the same time, still engage and find interesting new arrangements or groupings to be able to, move the needle forwards on some of these issues. So the kind of coalitions of the willing, interested, and able idea, because I suppose topics like, and this is not directly from any of the speeches, but just thinking more broadly, there are questions around arms control and what is happening to arms control architecture and frameworks, new technology and the norms around those. So I suppose countries are looking for ways and partners to have those discussions and to be able to agree on new sets of frameworks and norms to address the challenges that we see are continuing to evolve.
In addition to Macron, the Shangri-La Dialogue also had Kaja Kallas, High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy of the European Union, speak. And she was on the session where she spoke about how Europe was navigating in a more competitive world. To what extent did you see her remarks echo what President Macron said? And did she offer any path forward for how involved the European Union as a whole will be in the Indo-Pacific?
As an overarching theme, Bonnie, this was a really important one. We have, over the past years, seen Europe, including the European Union, but also capitals themselves, really become more interested, more engaged, and lay out strategies, guidelines, policy documents on how they engage and want to engage in the Indo-Pacific region. Many of them have those Indo-Pacific rather than Asia-Pacific strategies, as many will know, because of the interlinkages between the two oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. One evergreen question from the Asia-Pacific region has always been, one, what's the long-term vision here? Secondly, and crucially, what resources can be allocated to these objectives that European countries had been laying out? And one of those is, of course, defense engagement in the region. That all sounds great, and that is certainly welcomed. As I said, countries are looking to diversify their partnerships. But now, having seen, of course, the war in Ukraine enter into its third year, the pressures now on Europe to really shore up its own defense capabilities in Europe, a lot of questions were kind of being raised around, okay, well, then what does that mean for European engagement in the Indo-Pacific? How many defense resources really can there be allocated for the Indo-Pacific? And to be honest, I think the reflections from the European participants were kind of twofold. Of course, Secretary of Defense Hegseth had noted in his remarks that Europe has a competitive advantage in Europe. The United States has a competitive advantage in the Indo-Pacific region. He didn't note that that meant it was an either or that those are two mutually exclusive domains, but rather that the majority of Europe's engagement, emphasis, resource allocation should be in Europe. And then, of course, there will still be engagement in the region. But Europeans, I think, really at the dialogue tried to note and outline that they were still committed to the Indo-Pacific region, that they were still engaged in their partnerships, and that that would continue, not lessen. But there were also some points from speakers, including President Macron, as well as others, that highlighted that Europe couldn't be the major military power in the region. It couldn't respond at scale or be present at scale. And I think that's a very realistic perspective. That is the reality of the situation. Europe is geographically far away. Its resources are anchored predominantly in Europe. And so then it's about what other areas can Europe really leverage and engage on in the region. And defense industrial linkages were noted, issues in new technologies, be that AI, be that cyber, also experiences in some of these domains that Europe has had, such undersea and cable security, sharing lessons on that. And then another theme was one of resilience. So the experience of European states in managing disinformation or at least better understanding the challenges of disinformation and some of these grace-based hybrid tactics that many countries are facing. So I thought that was particularly interesting to see.
And as you mentioned, this is a very positive, long-term vision of a lot that Europe could offer, even if they can't be the major military power in the region.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right. There was that kind of sense of realism a little bit, but then also, again, this idea that even if it's not in defense hard power terms predominantly, there is still that energy, enthusiasm, and need for countries wherever they are to work together. And so I think that was that positive vision of everybody has to really invest in relationships, particularly at times of insecurity, to help bring forward stability.
Great, thank you. Meia, I want to turn to you to focus on U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's remarks, which have obviously received significant attention. My sense is his remarks sought to signal continuity in terms of U.S. focus on the Indo-Pacific, and it was also intended to reassure U.S. allies and partners of U.S. commitment. But given all that we've discussed earlier, what you and Veerle mentioned, it did seem like he had a pretty daunting task to reassure a number of U.S. allies and partners, but also, if where possible, to provide some reassurance on the concerns that a number of countries had in terms of what was happening to the international order and the U.S. role there. Was there anything that stood out to you from his remarks? And do you think overall his remarks helped alleviate some of the concerns regional countries had about the Trump administration?
I think you're right to say that there was a big task here to reassure. And I think for most in the audience and most in the region, people didn't really know what to expect. And this is the administration's first significant Asia policy speech focused on the Indo-Pacific and U.S. commitments to the Indo-Pacific. I think those who had watched Vice President Vance's remarks at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year we're really questioning what the tone of that speech was going to be from Secretary of Defense Hegseth. But I actually think everyone was pleasantly surprised, was impressed. He's obviously a very eloquent and strong public speaker. And I think the messages were reassuring to those in the region. Now, he went through various different points. It was a very strong speech. I think the overarching message, though, was one of urgency. And of course, there was an element of domestic politics in this speech, referencing President Trump, of course. But I don't think those in the audience or those from the region will really have focused too much on that. I think they understand that there's a need for directing some parts of the speech to a regional audience, an international audience, and of course also, importantly, domestic audiences. But really here, I think the view that the United States felt a sense of urgency was required for commitments and progress towards shoring up deterrence in the region is clear. He phrased that through a number of different ways, of course. One is the U.S. needs to do more at home. But similarly, his message to partners and allies in the region was one that he classified as tough love, but love nonetheless. A part of that picture of re-establishing deterrence in the region was very much through partnerships. And there, what will have taken up and caught up a lot of attention, I think, was the suggestion that countries in the region should spend more on defense and potentially even 5% of their GDP on defense. Now, I think, again, others in the region will have seen this as a starting point of a conversation rather than a request for a hard commitment, which, let's be honest, will be quite difficult for countries in the region nonetheless. But I think how he phrased partnerships was quite important, and the U.S. commitment to the region was quite important. Part of it was about the need to forward deploy for the U.S. to do more in the region and be more active. The second was to collaborate more on defense industrial strengths that countries in the region and the United States could find synergies on. And lastly, of course, to increase interoperability. Now, some of the surprises, there were quite a lot, I think, of really strong sound bites that came out of his speech that hit a number of topics. But I would say overall, one other takeaway is that he really wasn't shy about describing and attributing this growing threat, the threat that is gathering, as he mentioned it, to China. And he addressed China's role in the region very directly in very strong and clear terms, and talked about what the implications of that were for not just the Indo-Pacific, but the rest of the world as well. I think that directness is something that does set this speech apart from that of his predecessor, who talked about partnerships first, whereas the secretary this time in his speech was very direct to the point about the challenges and then talked about the way that partnerships can address those together with the United States.
Meia, would you say in terms of the actual concrete activities that he outlined, for example, you mentioned U.S. forward deploying more troops, more collaboration on defense industrial capabilities, increased interoperability, across the range of efforts that he outlined, did you see anything that was very different from the Biden term, or were what he outlined largely of continuity in terms of what DoD had been doing from the Biden term or earlier?
I think there's a sense of continuity here, but I think that was reassuring to the region. One thing to note, of course, was kind of doubling down on what partners need to do more of rather than just the United States. One thing that I think was perhaps, an element of continuity, but a new announcement was the first project within Piper, the Partnership for Indo-Pacific Industrial Resilience, which includes 14 allies and partners working with industry, capital providers, and key non-government stakeholders to strengthen industrial resilience, expand capacity, and accelerate deliveries, as the Secretary stated. And this included the plan to establish repair capability capacity for P-8 radar systems in Australia. And I think it's those types of statements or those types of announcements that countries in the region want to hear more of. They want to hear that commitment remains. And then they wanted to hear concrete next steps about how this is now being implemented or what new steps are being taken to progress these relationships and these projects. I would say that for many in the region, probably what the speech did was lay a good groundwork and a good foundation and that initial reassurance. They'll now be looking for implementation and how fast that happens.
Now, you also mentioned that Secretary Hegseth was more direct and forward in talking about the China threat and challenge. One aspect of his speech that was reported quite widely was where he warned of the imminent threat that China poses to Taiwan. How was that received by participants at the dialogue? And did you see any response from the Chinese on that part of the speech?
Well, I think he said that a threat gathers, and he warned that a potential conflict over Taiwan would be devastating for the world, not just for Taiwan or the Indo-Pacific, but for everyone. And I think what he was trying to do there was to bring countries in the region who might be looking at hedging with regard to their relationships between the US and China and don't really want to get involved in any discussions or decisions around Taiwan, to really underscore that if this does happen, everyone will be impacted by a conflict across the Taiwan Strait. He did mention, as you rightly said, that a conflict could be imminent, but then he also said that the United States hopes it isn't, but is realistic that it could happen, and therefore needs to prepare more earnestly and seriously together with partners and allies to deter any potential conflict. I thought countries in the region will have heard this before in terms of a warning about the potential impact on the global economy, for example, of a Taiwan conflict. But there's 2 points that I think I'd make to this. On the one hand, that sense of urgency around the need to prepare in order to deter was very palpable, and I think everyone took that on board in the audience. On the other hand, countries will have read in reporting and research in the last few years attempts to calculate just how large the impact of a Taiwan Strait conflict could be on the global economy. But I also question how much a number like a $10 trillion impact actually sinks into the minds. I mean, how do we even comprehend what that would look like for the average citizen in a country in Southeast Asia or in Northeast Asia or, in my country, the Netherlands? So I think there's still a question about the realistic possibility of this even happening. Countries, I think, in some cases, just hope that it won't happen or think that the destructive impact of a Taiwan conflict is so great and so unimaginable that it's actually unrealistic to ever occur. I think that urgency was felt, but we'll have to see what more the United States does to kind of help that sense of urgency sink in across the board. And the second point that I'd make is that there is, of course, a conversation that's happening in the region constantly about who in the US-China relationship is the more destabilizing actor. Which party is guilty of being more assertive or more provocative unnecessarily? This is a narrative battle that I think is constantly ongoing. But here, Secretary Hegseth, I think, did take an opportunity in his speech to say, the United States is committed to the region, and we're in the room with you all talking about these very important topics, but somebody isn't. So he took the opportunity to highlight the Chinese high-level absence at the dialogue in order to, again, shore up that commitment that he was trying to get across and to say, if you do want to work together, if we are looking for coordination, cooperation to maintain stability in the region, then the United States is the partner that is present.
And let me bring Veerle into the conversation, given that, as Meia mentioned, the discussion that periodically surfaces in the region about who is the most destabilizing actor, the United States and China, and Secretary Hegseth's remarks that we're here, but the Chinese aren't. How did you see the absence of Chinese Minister Dong Jun, and did his absence impact any of the dynamics or discussions at the Shangri-La Dialogue? So was there more of a perception that because the U.S. Secretary of Defense is here and Dong Jun is not here, China is less vested? Or did you see any impact on his absence on the discussion overall?
I think that's a really good question. I don't think that countries necessarily thought that China is less vested in regional security or in international relations more broadly. But of course, it was noted that Minister Dong Jun wasn't there. I think one important point is that the possibility of a US-China meeting is sometimes seen by some as a bellwether of the state of the bilateral relationship. And so there's always lots of analysis as to whether they will or won't meet, and everyone is always keenly paying attention to that. So perhaps the fact that that meeting couldn't happen because Minister Dong Jun wasn't there may not have been terribly reassuring. I think a good signal would have been if they had, one, both been there, and two, had a meeting, but that is, of course, for governments themselves to decide. I think the other point is that many countries really look forward to China's speech as well on the Sunday morning, as it is traditionally, to understand China's perspective. And Meia has already touched on that, but that is seen as, one of the key opportunities to really hear directly from China's defense minister on China's own vision and China's own interests in the region. Many countries, of course, underscore the need for mutual understanding between countries, whomever they are. And in that respect, the Shangri-La Dialogue is that platform for defense diplomacy. And they will have not, unfortunately, had that opportunity for their bilateral meetings, of which there are every year many with the Chinese Minister of Defense.
So it seems, Veerle, what you're saying is because Dong Jun was not there, it at least sent a signal to most of the participants at the dialogue that potentially U.S.-China competition might be intense because there was no opportunity for the two sides to engage. And also a little bit more uncertainty on China's role because participants weren't able to hear directly from the Chinese Minister of Defense.
The latter, certainly, just in terms of not having that opportunity to have that yearly touch point to get an updated understanding directly with the defense minister. But on that first point that you made in terms of it's a more competitive bilateral relationship between the United States and China, again, I don't think anybody will say that they know why China wasn't present. And in that respect, I don't think anyone necessarily drew direct conclusions from the Chinese defense minister not being at the Shangri-La Dialogue. I think more generally, many will be looking at the bilateral relationship writ large and how that is evolving. Many will be looking at the bilateral relationship writ large and the news that, continues to come out on that, be that on negotiations, the trade relationship, or otherwise.
Maybe just to add one more point there in terms of that reassurance to the region and that question about who is the more destabilizing of the two great powers when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. I did think it was interesting that Secretary Hegseth kind of harked back to a way to frame conversations around China, trying to be more nuanced in how he discusses the PRC, so differentiating between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. He also made specific note to say that the US does not seek regime change and that it doesn't seek to humiliate the Chinese people, that it has deep respect for the Chinese civilization. And so I think in that sense, there was an element here to perhaps again reassure, to say that the US doesn't seek out a fight, but that it's just going to be more pragmatic and earnest in the need to prepare for one in case it does arise. On the US's messages to the rest of the region, I thought that was something that echoed through there as well, in which Secretary Hegseth talked about how the United States values partners in the region and also doesn't seek to tell them necessarily how to run their governments or judge their cultures. I actually think that that message landed quite strongly with countries in the region and will be a way that actually I think perhaps wins the US a favor in its engagement moving forward.
Well, that's obviously wonderful to hear. I do want to follow up a little bit more on the assessment of China's activities in the region, how that was portrayed at the Shangri-La Dialogue. I also saw at the dialogue there were quite a bit of reference to what some experts call the axis of upheaval, basically the relationship between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And President Macron in particular criticized China for not reining in North Korea and how North Korean munitions were already killing Europeans in Ukraine. To what extent was there a perception among participants or among the speakers about the growing cooperation between these four countries? And was that identified as a key regional challenge that actors needed to either deal with or be aware of?
I mean, to be honest, I think that that was a talking point in a number of the plenary speeches. But those were mainly messages that were sent by European speakers as opposed to speakers from the rest of the Indo-Pacific. Here, in particular, Europeans are, of course, as you say, very concerned about the interlinkages between China, Russia, and North Korea, and then the impact that that's having on European security in a very real way. And you will have noted that Macron, of course, in his speech criticized China for not doing more in terms of leveraging its relationship with North Korea and Russia in order to put pressure and kind of exert more influence to stop these relationships from having such a deep and real impact on European security. But I didn't hear those messages come from other partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific beyond perhaps the IP4. It does show that there's a difference in prioritization in terms of key security concerns between the two regions, despite those interlinkages between the two theaters, the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, coming up time and time again as something that all, I think, can agree upon. In the past Shangri-La Dialogue, certainly after February of 2022 and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there were numerous statements about the state of rules-based international order from countries in the region as well. And of course, the impact that global conflicts or conflicts in other parts of the world have on things like food security or energy security, and that everyone suffers from this instability no matter where it takes place. But this time, I think those exact same messages weren't carried across all of the speeches. I did think it was interesting on China, and I just noted President Macron criticized China for not perhaps doing enough with the leverage that it potentially could yield. On the other hand, I think there was a real diversity in how Europeans viewed the relationship with China and how they portrayed China in their speeches. On the one hand, Macron criticized China, but he also had stated that just as France considers the United States a friend, it too considers China a friend. That was one end of the spectrum. Whereas on the total opposite end of the spectrum, there was a defense minister from Lithuania who made very pointed remarks about how the activities that China conducts in cyberspace, for example, against Lithuania, or rather the cyber attacks that Lithuania experiences, do not indicate that the actors behind those attacks are a friend. She then said, and that is how we think about China. So you have two very different extremes of European countries and how they view their bilateral relationships with China. And in between, of course, you have a range of descriptions along the lines of the commonly expressed triptych of China being a cooperative partner, a challenge, and a competitor all at once to various different extents. And that disunity in messaging, despite the commonality and unity of messaging around the challenges that these regional interlinkages mean for European security, I thought was quite stark.
Fascinating. And I imagine perhaps there was also a range of differences within the Asia-Pacific region in terms of dealing with China or responding to the vast challenges that the region faces. And there I do want to turn to Veerle here. As you mentioned earlier, both you and Meia characterized how European leaders and speakers were presenting a positive vision, how they could do more for the region and in the region. To what extent did you see the regional countries respond positively to that? And was there any overarching response from the region to the changing global dynamics and security challenges? Or were countries taking very different approaches based off of their own interests as well as the different conditions that they face?
That's a really good question. There are, of course, a great diversity of speakers at the dialogue every year, and I think that's the strength. So it's difficult to generalize, but I think one overarching theme, Bonnie, was, as I've mentioned, the issue of partnerships and diversification of partnerships to shore up stability, be that regional or cross-regional. And here I thought that the remarks from Prime Minister Anwar of Malaysia were interesting when he noted that ASEAN was increasing its strategic aperture, as he called it, by not only having recently held the ASEAN GCC meeting, so the ASEAN Gulf Cooperation Council's meeting, but also for the first time convening an ASEAN GCC China trilateral. So that really, once again shows that everyone is trying to find their own ways of increasing that connective tissue between not just countries and partnerships, but regional organizations and partnerships, and doing that in a variety of different formats. The other example that was interesting was Japan's defense minister, who unveiled a new initiative called OCEAN, One Cooperative Effort Among Nations, is what that stands for. And that was an initiative that he noted was really for more like-minded nations to come together to focus on the Indo-Pacific region and to engage not just in dialogue, but to find new ways to work together to strengthen the regional international order. And at the same time, he noted to realize rather than to ignore accountability. And of course, there, I think he was talking about disruptive behavior in the Asia-Pacific region. Notably, no doubt, he was referring indirectly there to China. He expressed concerns, of course, of behavior and instability that continues to be seen in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And so this was kind of a new way to come together amongst a group of countries to refocus and re-engage and maybe inject a bit more new dynamism into finding new collaborative solutions.
Thank you very much, Veerle. Meia, let me bring you in here. Were there, from your perspective, any general policy recommendations that came out of the dialogue, particularly from our U.S., European, and close U.S. allies and partners? Recommendations on how to deal with the range of regional challenges?
Well, I suppose just a theme, as was already mentioned early on in our discussion, was that the range of challenges is so great and is, does transcend in some cases, particularly when it comes to the challenges that newer technologies pose and the like, really do transcend national boundaries and various theaters. So here, I think there was some mention of the real need for greater international collaboration and cooperation on establishing norms and rules around activity in new domains or activity that is conducted through the use of new technologies, whether that be AI or quantum or the like. And here, perhaps, I think European partners are already trying to play an active role with countries in the Indo-Pacific on some of these issues. Think, for example, of dialogues and conferences on the norms around the use of AI in military activity or for military end use. There's various initiatives going on around that. But clearly, I think everyone in the room felt like more could be done. But secondly, because so much is ongoing, that question around prioritization, I think, is really going to be one that, as Veerle mentioned before, countries in the region just want more clarity on how much and in what ways can countries in Asia continue to expect cooperation and collaboration from European partners on. And how persistent or permanent is this going to be given realistic constraints on European focus at the moment when it comes to security issues, in particular, ongoing war of Ukraine in Europe? So this question around division of labor, who has competitive strengths in what areas, and how can countries cooperate more to be able to align with each other better and not duplicate effort unnecessarily, continues to be a point of conversation. And again, this isn't new. I just think that the current geopolitical context makes these questions even more urgent to deal with. Lastly, I think is a question around, again, cooperation despite disagreement. So countries in the region will continue to want to see the United States and China cooperate, have dialogue, engage with each other as a sign of reassurance that the most important relationship between the world's two great powers isn't going to continuously spiral out of control, and how perhaps Europe can play a part in that. Although at the end of the day, I think it is very much a conversation that needs to take place between the US and China first and foremostly, is something that Europeans will be thinking about moving forward as well, despite their various different ways of viewing their own relationships with the PRC.
Thank you very much, Meia. And I think what you highlighted and what Veerle also highlighted is how complex and difficult it is to deal with the range of issues the region is facing. The two of you also highlighted how there are both areas of convergence and differences among countries in the region, but also even among the United States and our European friends in terms of how much we can help as well as contribute to the region. I really appreciate the two of you joining me for this fascinating discussion on the Shangri-La Dialogue. Obviously, we've only had less than an hour for this discussion, and the dialogue took place over multiple days. And there was significant discussion both at the plenary panels, but also between participants outside of the panels. I encourage all of my listeners to please visit the IISS website and listen to the sessions yourselves. Thank you very much, Veerle and Meia. I really appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us, Bonnie.
Thanks for the conversation, Bonnie.